Wake up, everybody. It's time for the History You Forgot podcast. It's the podcast where three veteran teachers with almost a combined 90 years of teaching try to help you remember what you slept through when you were younger. And today, a very important topic, the American Civil War. We're ready for it. Hope you are too.
Hey, I'm Jason Jones.
I'm Jeff Breedlove.
And I'm Jason Schmoida. And we got Civil War, boys.
Yeah.
Should be interesting.
should be
It's kind
good.
of all of a sudden, right? It's like Civil War.
All of a sudden, Civil War. Today, what we have for us is a Civil War-inspired drink called the Civil War. And as you can tell by looking at it, it's pretty similar to a Manhattan. And if you think about the bourbon and sweet vermouth, cherries and bitters, that would be a Manhattan. And what this adds that supposedly is going to give it more of that Civil War flavor is Chinar. Never tried Chinar.
I've never tried it either.
Gunsmoke and
Yep, never.
I just noticed we've got kind of a Manhattan type theme.
I think that's the idea. We keep putting bourbon in things. There might be something to that. But anyway, let's give the Civil War a try here. Yeah.
All right, to the Civil War.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Not too bad.
I just realized that we cheers to the Civil War, which is
I
little
guess
weird.
I did.
That's a little strange.
To the podcast, but
cheers to the podcast. There we go.
We don't need to do the Civil War.
That's right.
But I think we need to do some context.
Yeah, let's do a little
Jones,
context.
start it off. Where are we at?
Yeah, so, if you remember last time, we talked about the Jacksonian era and kind of the lead into the Civil War and kind of some causes. And now we're at the start or almost at the start of the war, and we're talking and looking at a couple things that are major players like the Industrial Revolution. And so if you guys remember, the Industrial Revolution started in Europe, moved over into the Americas, and the North, what we would call the North, are really going to be the major players in the Industrial Revolution, right? We're going to see things like the steamboat, the telegraph, the mechanical reaper, which is going to allow them to harvest grains, the cotton gin, different things like that are developed. But primarily, the manufacturing is happening in the North, and it is a kind of a free market society in the North, where in the South you've got primarily agriculture still being the main basis of way to make a living, and slavery is still very much involved. So
you've got all your big cities in the North too. Is that part of the driver behind that?
Sure.
Right. So and your population centers.
Yeah. So the economies are very different. And then if you throw slavery in and the idea of federalism versus states' rights, right? So you've got, federal laws are required for everyone to follow them. States are supposed to be have some sovereignty, and so they're allowed to set some of their own rules. And this becomes the big argument with slavery, that hey, in the South they believe they should be able to set this as one of their policies, even if the North chooses not to. And I want to point out that there were slaves in the North. Right. And we talked a little bit about the idea of, absolute, the abolishment of slavery.
Sure. Abolitionism.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And how that wasn't really civil rights.
Right.
That was, that was the ending of slavery.
Right. Yeah.
But that didn't mean we were going to give everybody the right to vote or to ability to own land, etc.
There's some stuff there at the end to talk about for sure. This reminds me, there's a good time to mention that term, federalism.
Yeah.
So we knew someone who used to bake a cake. Do you remember the federalism cake?
Cakes.
It was it was a 2-layered cake. There was a bottom layer and then the top layer, and the bottom and the top layer would kind of bleed together in the middle. And that was the whole concept, was that you had federal power, you had states power, and sometimes they bleed together. And where sometimes you get a little bit more of this and a little bit more of that. And I think it's interesting because that's kind of what we're fighting about here, really, is how much the states want to increase their power and the federal government wants to increase their power.
It's interesting that it's always framed around slavery.
Yeah.
Right. But I'm guessing, U.S. history guy, that there were other states versus federal issues.
Yeah.
Slavery just happens to be like the big sort of marquee.
Yeah, you might. We talked about it in the last episode with Jackson and the tariff, for example.
King. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And
National Bank and all that.
The pocketbooks being affected, right? If you're in slavery in the South, the pocketbooks being affected, and that tends to be a pretty big,
Yeah, which I guess the whole vote with your pocket.
Vote with your pocket.
Yeah. It's interesting. There are more reasons for the Civil War and causes, which we'll
Right.
get into, than slavery. But in my opinion, I've never found a way to just completely subtract it from it. You know, I know that
Right,
there's an
right, right,
argument that if slavery never existed, the Civil War still would have happened just because of this contrast of power. It's just hard. You can't take it out. It has got to be there. You know.
Well, it's just, I think
Yeah.
you can't separate the two.
No.
Right. I mean, it's clearly.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, right, that I think when you have these conversations now, it's much more understood that it's the states' rights issues around slavery and some other things, as opposed to everybody not wanting, slavery or whatever for the rights or the civil rights or civil liberties. I mean, it's a little bit more nuanced, I guess. Is kind of how it works.
But you hit the nail on the head with the money. I mean, was it I hope I can remember this. Thomas Jefferson had a great quote about slavery was like holding a tiger by his ears.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you let it go, it's going to destroy you, but you got to hold on it, and you've got some control over it right now. And I always thought that
still
was
might destroy you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and just a difference in slavery, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but in North and South, obviously in the South, they're working very hard on a plantation, picking, planting, really hard labor, where in the North, those slaves tended to be more chefs, cooks, aides, attendants. They still were working, no doubt about it, and they still were, and they were still forced. They were still property, but it was a different vibe or feel, even though both wrong.
As bad as slavery is, the worst place to be was on the plantation.
Right.
Right.
For sure.
It's a sliding scale of bad.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think you mentioned like there's a whole bunch of causes, right, that it isn't just, slavery is one, but I think we had discussed earlier that it goes back to the Mexican-American War as a kind of a good place to start. Yeah. And if you remember, right, Mexican-American War was all about sort of giving or allowing Texas to be part of the Union. So there was, a situation where the boundary, I guess, the Mexicans wanted it to be one river a little bit further north.
The Nueces River.
And then the U.S. wanted it to be a little further south. Or the Texans, actually, remember Texas is an independent state, actually independent country-ish, right, autonomous region. They wanted it to be the Rio Grande. Well, Polk, right, sent troops across to basically taunt the Mexicans. The Mexican government pushed the army back and, used their force to get the Americans out. And then, of course, we've got a situation now where American lives are in danger and Mexico's, breached a contract and yada, yada. We've got a war.
Polk was interested in buying California, which is what he was trying.
He had already made a deal,
and
right?
that's why they wouldn't go for it.
Right. 25
which is
million.
Why you put troops on what we think is the border, which goes across what they think is the border and provoke the whole thing.
It's one of those sort of, which came first. But they turned our offer down. It's actually not just California, right? It's basically everything between Texas and California, right? So Utah territory,
Arizona,
New Mexico,
Arizona and Mexico, right? So I read somewhere though that $25 million, which, you think like who would sell, half the country? It's worth like something like 800 million or something today, right? Which still, considering what they're giving up, can't be that much money, but we've got our war, right? And I think you would argue that the war was polarizing from the start, right? Everybody knew that if Texas, being mostly populated, right, by American citizens who had gone to Texas, they wanted to be part of the states. But if they had been allowed, that slavery would have been another issue, right? Texas would have been admitted as a slave state. Then, so we've got slavery again popping, up and about the Mexican-American War. But if I understand right, and you can quote me, it kind of went south bad, right? Like people immediately,
literally and figuratively.
Oh my God, hey, look at that. No, in the sense that like public opinion, it did a whole bunch of nationalism, rah rah rah.
Yeah.
But then the popularity of it fell as it cost a lot of money and American lives were at stake. It wasn't, as wonderful as we kind of thought it was going to be, and it was dragging out a little long.
And slavery had been outlawed kind of internationally since, what was it, 1807? The slave trade.
The slave trade.
Slavery itself, right, but the slave trade was...
Right. So it's still a divisive issue 50 years later in the States.
Right. And then the question of expanding territory and expanding slavery with it, knowing that the slave trade is illegal, but we're doing it anyway.
Right.
And
all of that.
And the idea that we want a balance.
Yeah.
Right. We want a balance of slave and free.
As you bring states in.
Yeah. Which by the way, that's why Jackson didn't want to annex Texas and chose not to and pushed it down the line to Polk. Polk is like the ultimate manifest destiny president. Right. Polk ran and said, I'm going to bring Oregon, I'm going to bring Texas, I'm going to bring California. And he had 5 things he promised: an independent treasury and a tariff. I went, okay, I won't do that. I'm sorry, I'm doing this again.
No, this is the best part.
Right.
I went and saw a presidential scholar, right? This guy that was writing books about presidents and how we rate presidents. And he made the claim in the middle of this pretty big room that James Polk was the most successful president ever in American history.
Because he hit all 5.
And everybody said, how did he do? Well, he one term, and he promised, I'm only going to be president for 4 years. I'm going to do these 5 things and I'm out. And he did exactly what he said. He's probably the only person ever in history to do exactly what he said. It created a poop storm, and he was out. Right? He was out.
Right. Because a whole bunch of like things that like didn't end when he left.
Maybe that's why every state has a Polk County. I mean, or almost every state.
That's a pretty nice reference. Yeah,
I hadn't thought of that.
Clearly, right? Yeah, I hadn't either. But when the war ends in America's favor, right, and we capture, the Mexican president, and it ends with a treaty. The issue of slavery, right, or Texas entering as a slave state, still an issue. So we end up with the Missouri Compromise.
Compromise of 1850.
Right, not sorry, it's off there. 1850, okay. Which then allowed California to come in as a free state, Texas as a slave state.
Right.
And then
Texas is actually already admitted, but it helped that create that.
And then the other territories in between the two got to decide, right? The states, as they would come in, they would be able to choose, and it kind of somehow mitigated the Texas thing.
Well, and this kind of, to bring it closer to home, right, is where we kind of, if you've ever heard of Bleeding Kansas, when I moved to the area and was getting my teaching certificate for the state of Kansas, that was a class I took, and that was very fascinating to go to spots or locations that were a part of this Bleeding Kansas and Lawrence burning to the ground and all these different things.
Yeah, that's actually perfect. Because it sets us right into that motion, because the Compromise of 1850, you said the people got to decide, and they called that popular sovereignty. Right. So in a really weird, ironic way, they were voting in a democratic way for slavery, which would be the most undemocratic thing. But
I think the other thing that, as a context or as a catalyst, right, both I think Bleeding Kansas and well as the war in Texas, Mexican-American War, is you have a lot of players in the Civil War, generals, et cetera, who sort of earned their stripes in the Mexican-American War, in these issues like Bleeding Kansas, right? The names that all became sort of, heroes of American Revolution, and that kind of then will play into how the war, as people take sides, how they end up choosing their sides, right? So I thought that was kind of interesting. But I think the other thing that, as I was kind of looking this up and thinking about this, is that it seemed to me that, as I read up on this, that people realized that the Mexican-American War, that Texas, the Compromise, that this was a slippery slope, that there wasn't going to be a non-partisan or an easy solution out of this, right? Like even in the 1850s, people were like, all right, this is not going to end well. Right. This isn't going to, diplomacy and treaties isn't going to cut it. Oh, because I think, didn't it also reinforce the Fugitive Slave Act? The Compromise of 1850 tightened it up.
It made it worse.
Right, because they all went ahead, and all those slaves that had been escaped were all had to go back, and it made it much more of a crime to harbor.
Yes.
So that was, we're kind of priming the pump.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and talking about which side you picked.
Right.
At that time, how long had we been a nation? 60, 70 years?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And so,
80,
the idea that you were loyal still to your state first.
Yeah.
Right. And before necessarily the country at the time.
Yeah. It wasn't uncommon. It wasn't uncommon. So with popular sovereignty, though, out of the Compromise of 1850 comes a question of, all right, well, can we choose? Is that the most democratic way to do it? Right. And interestingly, there is a piece of what was still the Louisiana Territory that was designated to be free. If you go back, Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, if you go back far enough, that's what drew a line through the Louisiana Territory. Right. Missouri came in as a slave state, but everything above them, that's kind of where that idea, that was the 3630 parallel, and everything above it could be slaves or free state, and everything below it could be slave state, but there wasn't much there until you had Texas, Arizona, New Mexico territories all the way to California. Right. And then the question is, now what do we do with it? If popular sovereignty works there, Now, all of a sudden, in
Why won't it?
1854, there's this
Right.
Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Right.
And there's a guy in Chicago that wants to build a railroad all the way to California, and he knows in order to do it, he wants to settle this territory, but he's got to get Southern votes to do it. And Stephen Douglas, in order to get the railroad to go from Chicago all the way to the Pacific, he rallies the Southern Democrats and promises them the opportunity to bring more slavery with them. And he promises popular sovereignty in Kansas if we separate Kansas from Nebraska and Louisiana territory. And that's, poop hits the fan, right? That's where everything gets thrown into play.
It's twice.
We have, I don't know. I don't want to say it the wrong way.
Is there a wrong one?
The wrong way. Long story short on Bleeding Kansas, multiple elections, 2 working governments, one with a pro-slavery constitution in the Lecompton Constitution, another with a free states, constitution working out of Topeka and Lawrence. And this is home for us. This is why we know so much about Kansas, by the way. And this is a fascinating story because the Civil War really, the Civil War really began here, and they started to shoot at each other. They created little bands of young men that would go out and kind of sabotage each other.
Right.
The Bushwhackers were tied to Missouri, and they were hoping to bring slavery westward into Kansas. The Jayhawkers,
I was going to say, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So if you've ever seen the outlaw Josie Wales, and not to throw out one of my favorite movies,
or to age us,
but yeah, right. But the Bushwhackers and the Jayhawkers are talked about.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things where I just listen to you, right? Because I know of it.
Yeah.
But it's like the last topic, right? There are things you can teach history for 30 years, and I still am the weakest, and ironically, on American history. So to listen to you go into these and connect it all, I think I'm learning as much as you guys. It's been fascinating.
So we got to bring up Abe Lincoln.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do we what's his role in?
I mean, we're getting there. So
real fast,
go.
To add to this, if I'm not mistaken, didn't the Compromise of 1850, then that kind of gave rise to the Whig Party?
No,
right?
Whigs are going to be gone after this.
Okay, that's what I knew. There was something.
It's actually
my brain is working a little.
A couple of us could use a wig.
I knew there was something about the Whigs, and then because Lincoln originally was
a Whig.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of where we're going with it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So if let me tie a few loose ends together here, if that's all right. So we got.
Sorry, I didn't mean.
No, it's perfect. It's actually
perfect. Wrong.
We've got Bleeding Kansas. And we have this argument between whether it should be a free state or a slave state, and the battles between the Bushwhackers and the Jayhawkers and all that. You would think that a president of the United States, as federal government, would come in and say, hey, you guys are shooting at each other. Something's wrong. What can we do? There were 2 presidents that kind of saw these unfold. The first, for a short period, was Franklin Pierce. Pierce was a Southerner, pro-Southerner, didn't do much about it. Buchanan was elected right after it. Buchanan also was not a Southerner, but he favored the South. He was a Democrat. He knew he needed Democratic votes from the South. So he didn't do much about it. In fact, they even labeled him Kansas-less. Like he didn't have an opinion because he didn't want to say anything and just kind of So this thing bubbled over. And it bubbled over into ultimately the question about popular sovereignty. Can we keep popular sovereignty as a principle? Well, in the Illinois Senate debate, okay, and this is where Abe Lincoln comes in.
Seriously, how do you remember all
this is great. This is an awesome story. I mean, it's amazing.
And I'm sorry, now I want to go back to Bleeding Kansas too, but
that's okay.
When I studied it, and this, I think this is still correct, but anyway, the people from Missouri would attack in Kansas and then run back across the state line like they thought that protected them,
right?
And then vice versa, right? The Kansans would go into Missouri, raid a town, kill people, run back, and think that, hey, I'm back in Kansas, I'm safe.
We could do. I mean, we could probably not attract many
could
probably not attract many coastal listeners, but we could do a whole episode on the Kansas-Missouri border wars.
But it's one of those kind of things. It's not just regional war. I mean, it's critical to the Civil War.
For example, you mentioned Quantrill, right?
Yeah, Quantrill.
He was against slavery.
Yeah.
And the whole reason he was on the pro-slavery side was because his sister was in a jail in Kansas City when it was raided and she was killed. And he just went on a violent rampage to punish anyone that had anything to do with his sister dying. So it wasn't really like pro-slavery versus anti-slavery. It wasn't a moral crusade, guys. It just wasn't.
Which is, I think, a really good point, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes
I got a soft Lincoln, but let's go back to Lincoln. So the presidential election.
Well, let's shoot before that, right? Before that. The Illinois, I was just trying to get to the popular sovereignty in the Illinois Senate debate in 1850. What would that be? 58, I think. Stephen Douglas was the guy who was trying to run the railroad from Chicago, and he's the guy who said popular sovereignty. Well, in 1857, the year before that debate, the Supreme Court came out with this bombshell case.
There we go.
And this is the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott versus Sanford, a former slave whose owner had freed him and died, basically, sued for his freedom. The expectation was that the court would say, you as a former slave and a non-citizen have no right to sue in this court. And that would have been bad enough, right? But
legally.
Instead, what the court did is went well beyond it. Justice Roger Taney was the Chief Justice, and he's like, we're going to protect slavery. And he knew how to do it. And they basically said, not only do you have a right not to sue, but the states that are claiming the right to be a free state have no right to violate the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, which deal with property issues.
Right. And
therefore, any state that claims to be a free state is actually in violation of the Constitution. So the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional.
Right.
And remember, slaves were property.
Slaves are property, and therefore you can't take a white man's property. And that was the decision of the Supreme Court. So that throws this whole thing up in the air, right? In Illinois, Stephen Douglas was the popular sovereignty guy. So everyone's like, well, now what are you going to do with popular sovereignty? Because you can't, evidently you can't be.
Right.
And so he's campaigning on, you can still do popular sovereignty. And Abe Lincoln, the candidate who's in transition from Whig to Republican, is like, you can't have it. There's a famous quote from Abraham Lincoln in that Senate debate was, you can't exist as a nation half slave and half free. Like, we're going to have to decide.
You can pick one.
Are we a nation of slaves? Are we a nation that's free? And he just left it at that, which was really cool. It's what put him on the map for 2 years later to become that kind of compromise candidate in 1860. Because in 1860, there were a lot of what were called radical abolitionists that wanted to completely abolish slavery. And what Lincoln was saying is, what if we just don't expand it into new territory?
Right.
But he forced them to all have their own opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, you had to take a stand. You had to pick.
Yeah, you got to do something.
Right.
Do something. But the funny thing is that
both ways.
But the funny part about it, to be honest, is like when he was running in 1860, he didn't take that position.
Right.
Because his position in 1860 was,
votes.
We just don't want to expand slavery into new territory.
Well, and not to go way outside, but my understanding, right, the Electoral College is sort of all created around this as well to give those southern states equal, if not better representation in choosing a president.
It was the Electoral College that screwed him here.
That's what I was going to say. So you're going to have to appeal to everybody. So you're going to have to choose your lane.
It all
pretty wide.
At any given moment, it depends. And you know this, like right now, we have an Electoral College that sort of favors some states over others.
Small states.
Small states are kind of at an advantage right now. Back in those days, northern states were very clearly at an advantage.
And I can. So just to make sure everybody remembers, your electoral college votes are based on your representation in the House and Senate. So every state is guaranteed one representative and 2 senators. So you got at least 3 votes.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So
that's
California right now has got like 58 votes or whatever it is because of their population.
Because of their population being larger. And the northern states had more population, which meant they had more representation in the House. Right. Even if the Senate votes were balanced, which most of the time they were, they tried to do that. But even if they were, they would end up with more electoral votes. So in that election of 1860, the Democratic Party split. The Northern Democrats, they nominated Stephen Douglas, our guy from Illinois, and our Southern Democrats and elected a guy named John Breckinridge. And then there was a third split of moderates, right? And the moderates were in those border states. They didn't want a war. They lived in Maryland, Virginia. They didn't want a war because they lived there. And they knew the war would be fought in their backyard. So they were trying to come up with some kind of a Missouri Compromise, stitch it up fix to finish this. And then you have the Republican, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in most southern states. And yet, with 40% of the total popular vote, he won more than the majority of electoral vote and became president.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
It's fun. Again, like I hope you're as fascinated as we are. I mean, that's It's amazing.
Well,
I
and then
never
he's
thought about it like
considered
that.
one of the greatest presidents we've ever had. You know, and
It kind of probably depends on who you talk to, but yeah.
but he's in the conversation. I'm
absolutely,
not saying
100%.
he is the one, but I'm just saying he's.
Yeah, I've been to parts of the country that wouldn't agree, but yeah, sure.
I
I
probably
think
know
so.
people who are around here.
But I think you're right. I think overall, by holding the nation together, the vast majority of people would agree.
Yeah. No.
Preserving the Union, right?
I mean, what he's associated with, right,
Yeah.
is, settling the Civil War,
Yeah.
doing the, issue of slavery. I think those are, right, what kind of...
And it costs him at the end. We'll get to that later.
Right, which,
Well,
I mean, we'll get there. We'll get there here in a little bit.
That was the final straw. Lincoln's election was the final straw, and you had 7 states secede, and they tried to piecemeal an agreement together to fix things before he was inaugurated, and he nixed it, basically. They were trying to come up with a compromise, and he said, look, I ran on, we're not extending slavery into new states, and I'm not going to give on that, and that folded. So you ended up with 11 states that seceded from the Union.
Right, which, if we follow the format, right, so we've got our context, we know what's going on. We've got our sort of lead up, sort of catalyst moments, right? We kind of hit them all 3, and now the election of Lincoln. And so I think we're going to kind of try to give you the 3 or so battles you need to remember, right? That are sort of representative of all of them in a way. Not that we're trying to.
And Jeff, we talked about the fighting in Kansas and Missouri, where kind of some of the first shots were fired, but then the first shots that are considered the first shots of the war were
Sumter.
Fort Sumter.
Yeah. It's interesting because the question is,
first of all, like you were quizzing him.
Well,
he wasn't going to get it right. Like,
I was hoping.
It's okay.
I, of course, would have been like.
Then I would have prompted him with another question.
Another question.
So student focused.
Oh, yes.
Can you secede from the Union?
That's a great question.
And that was just the question. Like Lincoln, his position originally was like, no, you can't do that.
Like, can you do it?
Yeah.
Right.
It's not like you can pick Virginia up and move it somewhere.
Right.
So like we're no longer part of the Union. And Lincoln was like, you can't do that. And they were saying, yes, we can.
And just a geographical, because I'm the geography guy, the Mason-Dixon line.
Yeah.
Right. We all think it's this southern line somewhere way down south. And it's at like Maryland.
Maryland, yeah.
Way north. Way north.
Well, because there was slavery in Maryland.
I mean, those mid-Atlantic states or so.
Yeah.
But I forget this. Yeah.
But I think
DC's a southern city.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
At the time.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I mean, it's still, considered sort of
technically.
Yeah, weird.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like one as much, but
yeah, no.
Yeah, so we got shots. We got shots fired.
So we have this question about whether you can secede or not, and then when in at Fort Sumter, right off the coast of South Carolina, right there's a base. The South Carolinians, or at least the rebels at that point in time, took control of that base, and that's when Lincoln had to send troops.
Yeah.
So that really is what kicked it off.
There's the actual fighting,
right?
There's kind of a long story that unfolds here for the first couple years because, Lincoln's initial policy is let's just send a bunch of troops down there. Bum rush them. They're going to quit. This is folly. That's the Civil War era word for it, right? This is folly. And the Southerners were like, bring those Yanks down here. We'll punch them in the mouth. And as soon as they get hit hard, they'll turn around and run home. And I think they found that they were both wrong.
Yeah.
And some of those early battles on the Virginia Peninsula were just brutal.
Which is, I think, we started with Antietam is kind of what we.
So that's setting us up for Antietam.
And this is still, they were still fighting the gentlemanly type of war where they're lining up across the field from each other 100 yards apart. Yeah. But now they've got rifled barrels and guns that are much more.
I remember teaching.
Much better.
Yeah, that like people used to sort of like know where the fighting was going to be on the
and they'd watch
park, the farm outside of town, right? You take a picnic and you'd sort of root your side on, and then I think as it turned, the carnage clearly got worse. It became less of a family event.
Luckily, that didn't work. That didn't last long.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, but at the beginning, it was definitely that old style. Right. Yeah. But there's a reason why we chose Antietam.
Yeah.
Sort of, the first.
So to get to that, there's, Lincoln has to get away from the idea that he's just sending troops to the South to like run the South over. It's not going to work. And so they come up with this larger strategy. And that's one of the things I can actually put the brakes on. I won't give you the whole detail, but it involves a blockade and it involves splitting the South in some ways. And it's a long-term strategy. So the idea now is that we need long-term. One of the pieces to that strategy was to free the slaves, emancipation. But Lincoln didn't want to do it as an act of desperation. And honestly, the Union was kind of getting their butts handed to them in Virginia.
Yeah.
So he was like, I need a win. If I can get a win.
A little justification for it, right?
So Lee decided to invade Maryland, a border state. Now, those border states were really important because, like Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, those were the states on the border. Especially Maryland was important because if the Confederates could actually win over Maryland, they would surround Washington, D.C., which was a big deal.
Ports, and you got
Yeah. So he hoped that if he invaded Maryland, he would be able to get Marylanders to join in and maybe take over D.C. But the famous story is they dropped somewhere along the line. They dropped a cigar box with some of their battle plans.
Who's they?
The Confederates.
Okay.
Sorry,
Yeah, no, it's okay. I'm looking for a noun.
Some scout probably, and some Union scout found it and brought it to General McClellan, and General McClellan found it and was able to. McClellan's a whole other story we don't have to get into, but he could have very easily won the Battle of Antietam handily, but instead didn't, which was kind of his jam. That's what he did. He always backed off at the last minute and made it harder. But it was at least a draw, if not a Union win, in Maryland, a border state.
Right.
And that gave Lincoln the opportunity to issue Emancipation. So that really is going to change the focal point of the war at that point. Let's talk about making a long story short.
Or a long story less
or a short
long.
story longer. Yeah.
One of the battlefields I've been at is Gettysburg.
Oh,
Yeah,
I've
which I
actually
think,
been
yeah.
right, which we kind of picked as, and I think most historians would argue is the most critical kind of turning point, right? Where
No doubt.
you've got Meade from the north, and you've got Lee, right, the great, Southern general, meeting up in basically, Pennsylvania. But no one really thinks about why it's in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
But in reality, right, it's railroads go through there. There's like 12 sort of national roads that all meet there. It's a hub. And it's a pretty important artery to Philadelphia.
Well, and it's also the only non-slavery
Right.
northern state now.
Right.
They've really pushed their
Right.
boundaries.
And Lee is clearly on an invade the North run, right? I mean, he's making all these inroads. And if Pennsylvania goes, I mean, it's a giant win. And, and I think we all know Gettysburg, right? The story of it, right? Equal size, right? You got 80,000 Southern troops, you got 100,000 Northern troops. It's ugly, right, from the get-go. And clearly it turns the tide because, at the end of the 3 days, B basically has to turn tail and run due to some bad decisions, but also there's this Pickett's charge where
it's a really bad decision.
Yeah, right. Where Meade kind of knew it was coming and set Lee up, and it was a slaughter, right? I mean, I think something like 9,000 casualties out of 12,000. I mean, and I think what also we have to remember too is that this is a huge sort of unifying moment, right, for the North. Like maybe our weapons are good, maybe our soldiers are actually pretty good, and to see Lee, who's on a roll, kind of turn, it's big deal. But they lost the South lost a couple really important generals.
Yeah.
In that campaign. So it wasn't just sort of your average, fighters. It was some pretty significant losses for South.
Well, then of course you also have Lincoln gets an opportunity to make a huge address.
Yeah, and which is clearly, but I think what it does, I think, in terms of like a turning point, right? It stops Lee.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so on this sort of win after win after win, the North is looking. They have to have something. They need a unified. Right. People are getting ugly and it's upset, and this just stops Lee. Yeah. Right. There's no more invasion of the North like they had planned.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Oh,
please. No, I mean,
you could pair within a couple of days the victory at Gettysburg with a victory way out in Mississippi in Vicksburg,
right?
Because that would completely sever the eastern and western portion of the Confederacy and give the Union the control of the Mississippi River,
right?
Which is just ginormous. Yeah.
Right. So I mean, this becomes a turning point because one, right, clearly the largest casualty on the battlefield in American history, right? 50,000 hurt, wounded, killed. I mean, just
frame of reference, we lost like 53 in Korea.
Right. This is in a 3-day battle.
3 days.
Right, 3 days.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that's a great reference, good point of reference, right? So, that makes it all super important. But like you said, the battle ends in June or July, and then Lincoln doesn't really go though until November. I mean, he kind of waits for it to settle down. He's got to make sure that the North is still on a campaign, right? That it isn't just a one-off. Right. But the speech clearly becomes the thing that we all read about it. We all know it. The amazing thing about it, right, is that it's 3 paragraphs, 270 words. Right? He's at the end of a sort of a commemorative event, and he speaks for 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Right. I do think though that the whole apocryphal. I wrote it on the back of an envelope. There's like 4 or 5 versions of it, right? He clearly ran it through some people. Yeah. But the significance is not only does it display how language and rhetoric can turn and sort of galvanize, right, and inspire. But what he does is he doesn't trash the South. Right. He doesn't go after them, doesn't go for the jugular. He praises all who were, who gave the sacrifice for their principles. He doesn't name them, but it's like,
and they're all Americans.
And the Union is more important, right? We have to preserve the Union. Yeah. And so their sacrifices, and so I think that's pretty important, right? He doesn't come out and blame.
Right.
It's an attempt to bring the Union back together and extol the virtues of the Union.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. When it's clearly an ugly point in time. So, I think, we all know the
Gettysburg Address.
Right. I mean, clearly, but if we go from there, then we kind of then move to then sort of the last of what Sherman's.
Yeah. Can I tee you? I'm going to tee you up.
Okay, tee me up
because
make it
because I've after
ball that I can get.
Are you going to get a mulligan?
Does it have to be that big? The Gettysburg the British will finally stop trying to aid, right? They stop trying to aid the South, and they're going to buy their cotton from other people.
I'm going to throw a little world history in here, right?
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, the British had taken the side of the South, which everyone kind of goes, why? But it was the cheap cotton, right? Remember this time Great Britain is the workshop of the world.
Again, the pocketbook.
And that they got a lot of money, and their colonial empires based on, right, cheap natural resources to feed their huge industrial base. As morally abhorrent, right, as slavery was, they were clearly hoping for some continuation of that cheap cotton. So that's why we're referencing Great Britain.
Yes, for sure. But it makes a difference because Britain was supplying money. Really cash, needed money to the South.
Like you said, right?
So without that, that whole idea of suffocating the South over a long period of time starts to sort of settle in. And that is what changes our focus then and brings us to kind of 1864, where it intensifies.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And Sherman is, in Atlanta or outside of Atlanta, and then takes the city. Was not the capital of Georgia, but was obviously a very important city in Georgia. Yeah. And when they take the city, the Union tells the people there to leave. Everybody has to leave. Yeah. And so Sherman's sitting there and in Atlanta, and he's trying to figure out what to do next. And he actually writes, I'm sure it was to Grant, but Lincoln maybe saw it as well, but basically a letter that said, hey, here's what I can do. I can start right here. I can march to the sea.
Here are options.
I just need you to say it's okay.
Yeah.
And I can end this down here. And it takes a little while.
It does.
But Grant finally responds and basically just says, do as you've requested.
Yeah.
It was that short.
Go for it.
Yeah. And so and I find these stats kind of interesting, 62,000 infantrymen, 5,000 cavalry, and 2,000 artillery men, so cannons. They're going to march 225 miles.
All the way through.
Yeah. From Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, and try to just demolish the South. And part of what they're doing is not just like when he leaves Atlanta, they've torn up all the railroad tracks. He encouraged them to set fire to all the industrial buildings, but of course it's still burnt. It still burnt houses and
total
churches.
War.
Yeah,
it's total war.
And that's what they do for 225 miles. And the interesting fact.
Well, and I'm just as I'm thinking about that because the numbers are. I mean, it's still a civil war, right? So you're doing it to eventually that you're going to punish them. Yeah. That you're going to want to win back, right? This isn't the way we've done this before. We haven't gone scorched earth.
Yeah. Well, and so he not only they don't have a supply line, right? So they're not getting supplies from the north. So they're literally going to plantations and farmhouses, and they've been told to take from the rich, not the poor, but they're taking from whoever has food.
Yeah, they are.
This would be Gone with the Wind, right?
Yeah. Right. Well, right. That was Atlanta.
Yeah, I was going to say, right.
And these rich Southerners are actually burying out in their fields their wealth, and believe it or not, their slaves are telling as the North comes in and takes these plantations and takes the food. The slaves are saying, here's where they buried it.
Oh, that's right.
And so they're going and digging this stuff up.
and they're supplying themselves with the food on the farms and the plantations.
And the
right?
slaves are
Feeding the
following
army.
the Union Army.
I was just going to say, because they know what the outcome is probably.
And the Union Army did some really crummy things to them along this way.
It was brutal.
But it's fascinating that all the way to Savannah they're doing this, and then they finally get to Savannah. There'd been skirmishes along the way. There'd been some Confederate attacks, but they didn't have a lot to offer. I mean, it was literally some hit and run stuff, and Sherman had sent in the cavalry to go deal with them.
Yes.
Yeah, and so when they get to Savannah, the Confederates that are there actually they retreat to the north. They leave, and so Savannah is taken without firing a shot. And the little bit of research I did on it, that they said that the mayor literally gave Sherman the key to the city.
To save it, right?
Yeah. And so Sherman, that march to the sea is fascinating. I encourage you to read about it. It's just really good.
Yeah, I would actually encourage you all to, if you're inspired. I am not a U.S. Mr. Jones. I have done probably more research about the Civil War in the last few days than I have in years. It's fascinating, right?
Yeah.
You should all take a few minutes and just Google it, right? I mean, like some of these battles and things are just epic.
Well, one interesting tidbit there on Sherman is that, for the longest time in the western part of the war, it was Grant. Everybody knows U.S. Grant, right? Ulysses Grant becomes president. He was in charge of that western campaign until after Vicksburg and Gettysburg. So after Vicksburg and Gettysburg, Grant went east to try to take Richmond. That put Sherman in charge. That was Sherman's impact.
There we go.
He created this just mass destructive, I'm going to just tear it apart. And it was meant to punish the South, like you said. The bad news for Richmond is Grant wasn't much better. And of course, Grant just laid siege to Richmond and eventually got that.
So correct me, I don't know the answer, but Andersonville, right, the great sort of prisoner of war camp, is part of everyone knows how bad it is by this point, right? It's only open like a year, and the people are sort of, the stories are out. I mean, it's a horrifying situation where the Confederates treat these captured Union soldiers. But I wonder if there's anything, if Sherman knows, or if that's kind of, I'm just wondering time-wise, I don't know. As I'm thinking about like the timing of this, I know the communication clearly was bad.
Yeah.
But if you're hearing horror stories about the way Confederates are treating Union soldiers, which I'm sure that Union prison camps were just as bad. But if you're already on a march, right, and you have the ability to destroy, your aim might be a little uglier because of what the backstory.
It was ugly.
There's lots of pieces that were ugly. The families that were divided and fighting on opposite sides. Yeah,
there's a lot of
the living conditions for the soldiers. Yeah, right. I mean,
and the hospitals. I mean, more people probably died from the disease and infections than they did. The bullet. You get shot, right, and it clearly will turn septic, and then the only option is to cut it off or whatever, right? I mean, but it does introduce though the beginnings of sort of. I mean, it's the last war that is sort of fought pre-industrial revolution and medicine that we know, antibiotics and things.
You're seeing though the industrial revolution is showing up in some of our weapons.
Yeah, totally.
It's not showing up in our medicine though, right? Like I'm gonna put right here a picture of a medical kit for a doctor during the Civil War, and it was saws, picks, and knives, because
and something about down on
a tourniquet and something about, and it was all about just getting. And you think about it, like we're advancing in the way we kill people, but we haven't advanced in how we put people back together.
It wasn't Clara Barton, wasn't this Red Cross and those kinds of things starting at this time, or was it already?
Yeah, it was. Clara Barton got her name.
That's
here,
how she gets her name.
Yeah, that's a great.
She saw the angel of the battlefield, right? I mean, has that reputation of doing more than typically have been done, right, for these. But yeah, the fact that you're wounded, the chances are you will probably die from the wound regardless. But I do remember, there's like piles of arms and piles of legs, right? Because the only answer was cut it off.
Yeah,
right. And if you're hitting the torso, you're probably dead.
You're probably going to die an ugly, painful, long death.
Bleed out.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we've got our three battles. So if we, I know, right? So if we want to kind of wrap it up in the sense that a whole nother episode probably is, what's coming, but what are the sort of immediate impacts, right? Like right away, what changes? And I think clearly we have to start with, Lincoln's assassination. Yeah. Right. Which is part of a conspiracy, a plot to sort of revive the South. Right. And you've got Booth and his conspirators, and there is research done on, what his motives really were, right? I mean, in terms of clearly he was pro-Southern, and the war had only just ended weeks ahead of time. Right. So that's still very in their mouths, right? In terms of the feeling.
And he was famous.
Yeah, and he was a famous actor, right? That's how he gains access to the theater, is that people know him and he's able to kind of walk where nobody else would have gone. But there are also stories that, like, his brother was another really famous actor. I mean, like, more famous, and he was a pro-union. So there's there's sibling rivalry going on here. There's clearly this reviving the South, but that, there are multiple sort of variations of the story, but clearly, right, with a conspiracy that 3 men are targeted on this night: Lincoln, Vice President Johnson, and then Secretary of State Seward, thinking, right, that would shake up the victory so badly that it would give the South, right, a little bit of a spur, like, it's not over, right? We don't have this. But unfortunately, he succeeds with Lincoln. Yeah. Seward is attacked and stabbed. Yeah. And so his son is knocked out, and a bunch of bodyguards. I mean, it's a brutal, ugly night. He has a scar that lasts forever. He's already wounded from, like, a carriage accident. So he's in bed when, the assassin comes and kind of forces his way into the room. And then you have the last guy, right, who's supposed to go after Johnson, but ends up getting drunk in a bar and
I can't do it.
Right? Has second thoughts, right? And goes, you know what? So Johnson ends up unscathed, right? And Lincoln, ends up dead. Right. And it does then change, because Johnson, if I'm not mistaken, right, is a Southerner. Right. So the thought was, well, it can't be worse, right? Maybe he's going to have a little bit of pro-Southern sympathies. And Lincoln.
Johnson was a Tennessee Democrat who stayed loyal to the Union and didn't secede, which is why he got the vice presidency in 1864, right in the middle of the war. He was not the best human being.
Right.
And he would try to help the South, but was so bad at it that it created more animosity, more the Republicans in Congress basically rallied around him, long story short, and he ended up being
impeached. We're going to buy you a shirt.
I know. Long story short.
Or poop vest.
Well, another thing that comes out of this is the 13th Amendment.
Yes.
Which abolishes slavery. And just to bring up,
right? Like, I mean, it's over.
And just to bring up a point we mentioned earlier in the show, that abolishing slavery isn't giving slaves equal rights. It was literally
as a practice.
An amendment that is going to end slavery. And then we've got all sorts of other things that'll happen, right, with Jim Crow and everything.
I was going to say, but that triggers in, like, 14th and 15th Amendment pretty quick, right? Which in Secession, right, we got some. Yeah. Specifically, as a result of those, we end up with
13th Amendment abolishes slavery, as you said. It's not really about civil rights just yet.
Yep.
But if you get into the 14th and 15th Amendment, it does start to slide that way.
Right.
The 14th Amendment is the one that gives us equal protection of the law. And the equal protection of the law comes from the notion that citizens, right, are born citizens by nature.
Out, right?
That's fine.
Sorry for the
I don't think you could hear it. You probably couldn't hear it.
I know. I've got a kid upstairs who had a question.
Citizenship is guaranteed to those born in the country, then these slaves all are instantly given citizenship.
Because they're born in the country.
Because they're born in the country.
And then equal protection
so naturalization,
of the law.
that we keep hearing about even today.
And it's in the Constitution earlier. If you look in the Article 2 of the Constitution, and the president says a natural born citizen. So the idea of a natural born citizen is there, but then it comes back in the 14th Amendment when it's declared that now that makes slaves citizens. And then the 15th Amendment gives black men, all men other than white men, the right to vote.
Right. So all men.
And
all
so,
men.
So if you think about it, like, ultimately, and I don't know if I'm putting a bow on it yet or not, but, like, ultimately at the end of the day, the Civil War solved slavery. It solved the idea of secession. Like I said, could a state secede, could a state not? And no. In fact, there's a way to do it, but it has to go through Congress, which is hilarious,
which is ironic,
because it's not
right.
So then it left some things unpacked too, like state versus federal power was still going to be an issue.
And how do you all of a sudden end a 4-year horrible battle, state between state,
right, and put things back together? And civil rights. How are you going to actually provide that those things happen? And that's a long.
The Civil Rights Act of 1968.
Yes.
100 plus years after the war.
4 or
Right,
5.
yeah, I mean, is that
64,
crazy?
65. Yeah, 100 years later.
You know, so
I think immediate impact then, right? It's clearly one of the most significant 5-year periods, right? 10-year periods in American history, right? And the way it ends right changes the course of lives. Yes, right. I mean, directly, right?
It is the turning point. I've heard Shelby Foote was a famous Southern Civil War era, and he talk about it was a crossroads. I think he said that. I think that was like from the Ken Burns. But I love that. I love that guy's voice in my head. So it was a crossroads, and it was a hell of a crossroads.
I love it, right? Well,
love it. So
I think, not to put a bow on it, but we're going to kind of try to everything you shouldn't have remembered, not everything, but everything you should remember. But let's kind of start with Mr. Jones has got who he would like to have a drink with.
The Civil War.
War. As I say, like this time.
Gosh, guys, how many people could you choose at this? I mean, there's so many. I mean, Lincoln, Sherman, Grant. I mean, on and on and on.
I think Lee would have been a fascinating.
That's who I'm going to pick. I'm going to pick Robert E. Lee. And here's why, because here's a guy who graduated the top of his class in West Point, right? You have, and this is, I made the comment earlier, people were a lot of times more obligated to their state than even the country 70 years into our country's history. Right. And so here's a guy that is a Virginian. When secession starts, he goes with his state and he goes and leads the Confederate Army. And so I would love.
And he opposed both secession and slavery.
Yet he chose his state because
and so I would love to talk to him about those things, you know, and
it's a good choice.
Yeah. Why would you choose to go against the country? There's just so many questions to ask.
You would have to ask him about Pickett's charge.
Yeah.
Right. That was because
how did you screw that up so badly?
He would say that stripped him of the title of general.
Yeah.
That decision to send men across the field, it was a suicide mission, and it lost Gettysburg.
Right.
And he would claim, he told his people at, was it the Virginia Military Institute? One of the Virginia schools he taught at, he made them call him Mr. Lee, not General Lee, because he said, I lost that title.
In his mind, he was like,
Yeah.
Well, and I'd even like to know, Grant as a general, what were your real thoughts? I mean, because, Grant is, we know now he had a lot of, maybe we could say flaws, right? I mean,
and after, how do you go back to a life if you're Lee? Or
he lost.
Like that? I mean, like after that, does people treat you the same way? I mean, clearly it's going to impact everything that goes after.
Arlington National Cemetery is on his former plantation of his
land.
Yeah,
did they take it from him?
They took it from him.
There we go.
See, and so I think he'd be fascinating, or one of many fascinating people. To have a drink with.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of brings us to the end of our Civil War.
Already, that was quick.
Yeah, I know, right? It was. I learned a ton.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean that. But I think next week we're going to kind of go chronologically, but we're also going to broaden our scope a little bit, and we're going to do World War I, which chronologically falls right after the Civil War, but we're going to go ahead and shift a little bit back to the Great Wars era. So we will do World War I next time. And we hope, of course, that you continue to watch and enjoy. Do us a favor, though. Would you drop any kind of comments or feedback? Likes. I mean, we'd love to hear from you. I mean, if you have a question or if you have hey, I've got a comment, we love to hear them, and we're doing our best to answer them, right?
And Jeff, and I'm sorry, but go see some of these places. You can go to Ford Theater. You can go to Gettysburg. You can go to...
They're all there.
They're all there.
Class dismissed.
Class dismissed.